Hello everyone. Everyone knows that I served in the Navy. This is a cool story about how we made fun of the instructor. So, to set the scene, I had just joined a destroyer for my first real deployment. My name's Jake, and I was fresh out of Navy boot camp, trying to adjust to life on a ship that felt like a floating city of chaos. The first few days are always a blur, getting your gear together, trying to figure out where everything is, and making sure you don't look like a complete idiot. I had a solid group of people around me, including a seasoned guy named Tom, who was our instructor for the deployment. Tom was a tough guy, an old-school sailor who had been through more than I could ever imagine. But despite all his tough talk, there was a quiet respect that he carried with him. On the third day, I finally got the chance to wash some of my clothes. I had been wearing the same set of fatigues for a few days, and the smell? Let's just say it wasn't something I was proud of. So, I headed down to the laundry room. I started the load, but then I realized I forgot to grab the detergent. Rookie mistake, right? I figured I'd go back to my car, get the detergent, and be back before the cycle finished. That's where everything started to go sideways. I headed back to my car, thinking about how stupid I was for forgetting the detergent. I wasn't in a huge rush. The ship was quiet, most of the crew were either working or off doing their own thing, so I figured I had plenty of time. I grabbed the detergent from the trunk, then made my way back to the laundry room, already mentally preparing myself to finish the task. But when I walked in, something felt off. I stared at the washing machines, and for a second, I couldn't quite figure out what was missing. Then it hit me. My clothes. My wet clothes. Gone. I panicked for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. I walked out of the laundry room, thinking maybe I was just disoriented, but nope, my clothes were nowhere in sight. So, I walked around the deck, hoping someone had just moved them to a different spot. But no. Nothing. And that's when I saw it. Someone had thrown my clothes, still soaking wet, onto the deck. And if that wasn't bad enough, they'd even stuffed them into someone else's car. I was absolutely furious. Like, hot-blooded, red-faced angry. My clothes were a mess, probably ruined, and I had no idea who could have done this. At that moment, I didn't care about anything else. I just stormed over, grabbed those wet clothes, and tossed them over the side of the ship. I stood there for a moment, watching my clothes disappear into the ocean below. I was still fuming, heart racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins. For a second, I felt like I had done the right thing. They had no business touching my stuff, let alone ruining it. I wasn't about to let that slide. But then it hit me. I had just tossed someone else's stuff overboard. Someone who I didn't even know, but who was clearly part of this whole mess. And now I was standing there, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I walked back to the laundry room to try and get some perspective. I didn't have much time to think before someone tapped me on the shoulder. "Hey man, you good?" It was Tom, the instructor. He looked concerned, but there was something in his eyes that told me he knew something was wrong. "I don't know who thought it was okay to touch my clothes," I snapped. But they crossed the line. Tom raised an eyebrow, his usual calm demeanor shifting into something a bit more serious. "Look, I get it. But you can't just go around throwing stuff off the side of the ship. That's not how things work here. You've got to think before you act, Jake." I stared at him for a moment. His words hit hard, but I didn't want to hear it. "I don't care. They ruined my clothes, Tom. They deserve it," I muttered. Tom sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not about the clothes. It's about you letting yourself get carried away like that. You're here to learn, man. You need to keep your head on straight." I felt the weight of his words, but I couldn't shake the feeling of righteous anger. The next few days were tense. I tried to focus on my duties, but I couldn't shake what had happened. Every time I saw someone, I felt that familiar mix of anger and regret, like I had done something I couldn't take back. I had ruined my own clothes, sure, but the real mess was the chaos I had stirred up. I didn't know who had taken them or why they'd done it, but now, I was dealing with the consequences of my rash decision. And then, on the fourth day of deployment, it all came to a head. I was in the mess hall, trying to get a decent meal, when one of the crew members, a guy I didn't recognize, walked up to me. He was young, maybe in his early 20s, and had the look of someone who was still trying to prove himself. "You Jake?" he asked, his voice tense. "Yeah, that's me," I said, taking a bite of my food, not really caring what he wanted. "I need to talk to you about my clothes," he said, his face flushed with frustration. It took a second to connect the dots, but then I remembered. This was the guy whose clothes I had thrown overboard. The wet clothes that had made their way into his car. "Look, man, I'm sorry about what happened," I said, feeling a little guilty. "But you don't touch someone's stuff like that. My clothes were just left there, no reason for it." He shook his head, crossing his arms. "I didn't touch your clothes. I didn't even know they were yours until it was too late. I was just trying to get my laundry done." I blinked, taken aback. "Wait, what? You didn't take my clothes?" "No," he said, his voice steady now. "I was just there, and I thought I was helping by moving them out of the way. But when I realized what was going on, I didn't know what to do. By the time I got back, you had already tossed them overboard." I stood there, frozen. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. The anger, the rage that had driven me to make such a rash decision, it had all been based on a misunderstanding. I stood there, processing what this guy had just told me. My mind was racing. I couldn't believe it. I had thrown this guy's clothes overboard, but he hadn't even touched mine. He was just trying to help, probably out of some misguided sense of kindness, and I had misread the entire situation. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. He was still standing there, arms crossed, eyes locked on mine, waiting for me to say something. I felt this overwhelming sense of guilt creep up on me, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The anger I had felt was completely gone, replaced by something else. Something much worse. Shame. I thought you'd taken my stuff," I muttered, my voice almost a whisper. I didn't know what to do. I was pissed, and I just reacted. The guy's expression softened a little, though it was clear he wasn't entirely at peace with the situation. "Look, I get it. You were frustrated. But you can't just go around throwing people's stuff away like that, man. That's not how we do things in the Navy." I nodded, barely able to meet his eyes. I had made a huge mistake. I had let my emotions take over, and now I was paying for it. "Yeah, I know," I said, feeling small. "I really messed up." There was an awkward silence between us. Then, he sighed and shook his head. "It's all right, I guess. But you're gonna have to fix this, man. This isn't something you can just ignore." I knew he was right. I had to do something to make it right. But what could I do to undo the damage I had caused? The next few days were rough. I couldn't stop thinking about the guy's clothes, how I had tossed them into the ocean without a second thought. The reality of what I had done started to settle in, and I couldn't shake the feeling of embarrassment. My initial anger had blinded me, and now I was left with the consequences of my actions. I knew I had to make things right, but the question was, how? Apologizing felt like the first step, but I needed to do more. I had completely humiliated this guy, and even though he said it was all right, I knew that wasn't true. I had crossed a line, and I needed to make amends in a way that would actually mean something. I started by talking to Tom again. The old man had a way of cutting straight to the heart of a problem. If anyone could help me figure out what to do, it was him. "I messed up, Tom," I told him, my voice low. "I need to make it right. But I don't even know where to start." Tom looked at me for a long moment, eyes narrowing slightly. "You've got a lot to learn, Jake. You can't just undo the past. What you can do is show that you're taking responsibility. Do the right thing, not just for yourself, but for the people you've affected." I nodded, feeling like a child in front of him. "So what do I do?" He shrugged. "First off, you apologize. Be honest. Don't try to sugarcoat it. Then, if you really want to make it right, you find a way to help this guy out. Maybe it's helping him with some work, or doing something that shows you're not just a guy who reacts without thinking. It sounded simple, but in that moment, I realized it wasn't. It was going to take a lot more than an apology to fix the mess I'd created. The hardest part was finally facing the guy whose clothes I had thrown overboard. I knew I had to swallow my pride and apologize, but I still felt that burning embarrassment in the pit of my stomach. What I had done was unthinkable, and now it was time to own up to it. I found him in the mess hall again. He was sitting alone, picking at his food, and didn't notice me approaching until I was right next to him. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. Then I just said it. "Hey, man. I owe you a real apology." I could feel the weight of the words as they left my mouth. "I messed up. I threw your clothes overboard without even knowing what was going on. I was angry, and I shouldn't have reacted like that." He looked up at me, and for a split second, I thought he might brush it off or snap at me. But instead, he gave me a small, measured nod. "Yeah, you really screwed up, man," he said, but his tone wasn't harsh. It was matter of fact, like he'd already come to terms with it. "But I appreciate you owning up to it." I breathed a sigh of relief. At least he wasn't about to punch me in the face. That was a start. "I'm really sorry," I repeated, my voice sincere. "I want to make this right. If there's anything I can do to fix it, just let me know." He thought for a moment, then shrugged. "I don't need much. But if you really want to make it right, you could help me out with a few things. I could use some assistance with cleaning up the work areas this week. You're a good guy, Jake. Just think before you act next time, alright?" I nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility settle on my shoulders. It wasn't going to be easy to repair the damage I'd done, but this was a step in the right direction. The next few days were filled with hard, sweaty work. I joined the guy, whose name, by the way, turned out to be Mike, on the job, helping him clean up the mess in the work areas. I don't think he fully trusted me just yet, and I couldn't blame him. I had ruined his clothes, embarrassed him in front of the crew, and then acted like an idiot. Trust doesn't get rebuilt overnight, but I was ready to put in the work. As we scrubbed and moved supplies around, I started to understand Mike a little better. He wasn't just some random guy I had made a mistake with, he was a fellow sailor, trying to get through this deployment just like me. He had his own responsibilities, his own struggles, and it was clear that he didn't deserve to be caught up in the mess I had created. We didn't talk much at first. The silence wasn't awkward, though. It was just two guys doing their work, letting the tension between us slowly fade as the days went by. It wasn't until we were on our lunch break that things started to shift. "So, I've got to ask," Mike said, looking over at me with a slight grin. "What was it that set you off, anyway? I mean, I get that you were frustrated, but throwing my clothes over the side of the ship? That's some next-level anger." I laughed bitterly, wiping sweat off my brow. "Yeah, that was definitely a dumb move on my part. I honestly thought someone had taken my stuff and ruined it on purpose. I wasn't thinking straight. Just saw my wet clothes on the deck and snapped." Mike raised an eyebrow. "You know, most guys would have just asked around or checked to see who moved their stuff. But I guess you're not most guys." I chuckled, feeling lighter for the first time since the whole thing happened. "Yeah, I guess I'm just good at making terrible decisions." Mike nodded, clearly trying to lighten the mood. "Well, don't worry. You're not the first to screw up around here, and you won't be the last." It wasn't a full-on friendship, but I felt like we were getting there. Slowly, but surely, the tension was melting away. As the days dragged on, I started to realize just how much I had learned from this mess. It wasn't just about the apology or trying to fix things with Mike, it was about understanding how I had let my emotions get the best of me. This wasn't some petty disagreement or a simple mistake. It was a wake-up call. I had let myself get so caught up in my own frustration that I didn't stop to think about the consequences of my actions. And those consequences had rippled through the ship in a way I hadn't anticipated. I had made enemies, sure. But more than that, I had created a situation where people started questioning my judgment. As a new guy on the ship, that's the last thing you want. You're supposed to prove yourself, not make a fool of yourself. I had thrown away the chance to start off on the right foot, and that weighed on me. But the work with Mike wasn't just about making things right. It was about proving to myself that I could handle this kind of situation better. That I could be more thoughtful, more measured. Tom, the instructor, had been right. I needed to learn to think before I acted. I was here to learn, not to let my ego run the show. One afternoon, Tom pulled me aside while we were on break. He had this way of getting straight to the point, like he could always see through my bullshit. "Jake, I see you trying to make things right," he said, taking a drag from his cigarette. "But don't think this is just about you and Mike. It's about everyone on this ship. They're watching you. They're always watching you." I nodded, taking his words in. I had already messed up, but if I could prove that I was capable of learning and growing, then maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild my reputation. "Yeah, I get it, Tom. I'm trying to do better." He smirked, the corners of his mouth twitching. "Good. Keep at it. You'll get there. Just don't make the same mistake twice." As the weeks passed, the tension between Mike and me slowly began to ease. We started to talk more, not just about the laundry incident, but about life on the ship, what it was like to be away from home, and how we both dealt with the isolation that comes with being on deployment. It was strange how quickly things shifted from hostility to a kind of camaraderie. It was like an unspoken understanding between us, a silent agreement that we both messed up, but we were both trying to move past it. One evening, while we were cleaning up after another long shift, Mike asked me something that surprised me. "Why'd you apologize, man? Like, really apologize, not just to get it over with?" I paused, my hands frozen mid-motion as I thought about it. I wasn't exactly sure how to put it into words, but I gave it a shot. "I don't know," I said, wiping sweat from my forehead. "I guess I realized it wasn't just about the clothes. It was about respect. I mean, I crossed a line, and I owed it to you to own up to that, not just brush it off. And, honestly, it felt like the right thing to do. I didn't want to be the kind of guy who just keeps making excuses." Mike nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer. Respect goes both ways. That's what I've learned being on ships like this. And in that moment, I knew something had shifted, not just between Mike and me, but within myself. I wasn't perfect. Hell, I'd made a huge mistake. But I was learning how to own up to my mistakes and take responsibility. I was learning how to be a better sailor, a better man. A few weeks into the deployment, I began to see things differently. It wasn't just about my relationship with Mike anymore. It was about my entire approach to life on this ship. Every action, every decision, seemed to carry weight, and I couldn't afford to make mistakes like I had earlier, not if I wanted to earn the respect of my crew and prove I belonged here. One evening, as I was walking across the deck, I ran into Tom again. He was standing near the railing, looking out at the ocean. The sky was tinged with orange as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ship. There was something about that moment that felt almost surreal, like I was on the edge of some bigger realization. "You've been quieter lately," Tom said, not turning around as I approached. "What's going on?" I stood there for a second, trying to find the right words. "I've been thinking a lot. About everything." Tom raised an eyebrow, turning his head to look at me. "Yeah? About what?" I took a deep breath, looking out at the horizon. "I've realized that I've been reacting to things, instead of thinking them through. I got caught up in my own frustrations, and I hurt people because of it. I don't want to be that guy anymore." Tom was quiet for a moment, and I could almost feel the weight of his gaze on me. Then, finally, he spoke. "Good," he said simply. "You're figuring it out. This life isn't just about following orders. It's about responsibility. Taking responsibility for yourself, your actions, your crew. When you mess up, you own it. But when you do something right, you stand tall, too. Don't forget that." I let his words sink in. I was starting to understand the real lesson of this deployment. It wasn't about being the best sailor or the toughest guy on the ship. It was about integrity. About doing the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. And that was the kind of man I wanted to be. As the deployment continued, I worked hard to keep my focus. I wasn't just thinking about the laundry incident anymore that had become something of a distant memory. I still felt the weight of it, but it wasn't my defining moment anymore. I had moved on, and I was determined to make the most of my time aboard the destroyer. Mike and I became more comfortable with each other. We shared more than just work. We started to talk about our lives back home, about our families, about what we hoped for in the future. There was a respect between us now, an understanding that hadn't been there before. I wasn't just the guy who threw his clothes overboard. I was a fellow sailor who had made a mistake, learned from it, and was doing my best to be better. One night, as we were finishing up a shift, Mike turned to me with a half-smile. "You know, Jake, I didn't expect to become friends with the guy who tossed my clothes in the ocean," he said, laughing a little. I grinned. "Yeah, I didn't exactly expect that either. But I'm glad it turned out this way." He nodded, his tone more serious now. "I think you've shown that you're not just some hothead who reacts without thinking. That's something people notice, man. It's not easy to admit when you mess up, but when you do, it shows strength." I felt a rush of pride, though it was tempered with the humility that had come from owning up to my mistakes. "Thanks, Mike. That means a lot." That night, I lay in my bunk, staring up at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened. I had learned so much from this deployment, not just about being a sailor, but about being a person. I had learned the value of humility, of responsibility, and most importantly, the importance of thinking before acting. I had learned how to own my mistakes, and in doing so, I had earned back more than just my dignity. I had earned a place among my crew, a place where I could stand tall without the burden of regret. The days continued to pass, and slowly but surely, I started to see myself differently. But something strange happened too. The more time I spent trying to redeem myself, the more I noticed people looking at me differently. They weren't giving me the cold shoulder anymore. They weren't treating me like the guy who made a fool of himself with the laundry incident. It was like they were watching me, waiting to see if I could keep my word and prove I wasn't the same reckless guy I'd been. And then one day, while we were off duty, one of the senior crew members, an old-timer named Rick, approached me. Rick was the kind of guy who didn't say much but always seemed to be watching. He had a reputation for being sharp and fair, and if you earned his respect, it meant something. "Jake," he said, his gravelly voice catching my attention. "You've been doing good work lately. We noticed." I blinked, not sure what he meant. "Thanks, Rick. I've just been trying to keep my head down and focus." He gave me a small nod. "Yeah, well, you're doing more than that. The guys are talking. You've shown that you can own up to your mistakes and get back to work. That's a trait most people on this ship respect." It hit me like a ton of bricks. The respect I'd been working for was starting to come through. It wasn't instantaneous, but it was real. Slowly, I was becoming part of the crew. Slowly, I was earning my place back. "I appreciate that, Rick." "I'm just trying to do better," I said, grateful for the acknowledgement. He gave me a look that almost seemed approving. "Keep at it, Jake. We'll see how you do when the real challenges come." That was all he said before walking off, but it stayed with me. Rick, who didn't waste words on small talk, had seen the change. He had recognized that I wasn't the same guy who had caused a scene at the beginning of the deployment. It wasn't long after Rick's comment that the ship faced a real test, a situation that would push me to see if all the lessons I'd been learning were for real. We had been working long shifts, the kind that leave you exhausted, mentally and physically drained. And on top of that, we were navigating some rough seas. Tensions were high, and stress was running at full throttle. One night, during a late shift, things took a turn for the worse. A critical piece of equipment malfunctioned, and the whole ship was in a standstill while we tried to troubleshoot the issue. The air was thick with frustration, and everyone was on edge. The captain was barking orders, the engineers were scrambling to fix the issue, and it felt like the whole ship was holding its breath, waiting for things to go wrong. That's when things got complicated. Mike was on the team trying to get the equipment back online, and he had been working non-stop for hours. Tired, irritable, and probably past his breaking point, he snapped at one of the junior sailors who was trying to help. It wasn't much, just a harsh word, maybe a shove, but it was enough to draw attention. The whole crew went silent, and I saw the look in Mike's eyes, anger, frustration, and regret all mixed into one. He had let it all out at the wrong person, and now the whole situation was spiraling. Without thinking, I stepped in. I didn't have a plan, but I knew I had to do something before things escalated. I approached Mike and the junior sailor, putting myself between them. "Mike, calm down," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "It's been a long night, but you don't need to take it out on him." Mike turned to me, eyes flashing. For a split second, I thought he might snap at me too. But then, he saw the way I was standing, steady, calm, not backing down. He took a deep breath, and the tension in his shoulders melted. "I'm sorry, man," Mike said, his voice low. "I shouldn't have done that. I'm just so damn tired." The junior sailor nodded, looking relieved. I gave Mike a firm pat on the back. "Don't worry about it," I said. "Let's get this done together, all right?" The moment passed, and we got back to work, but I could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The crew was watching, and this time, I had acted differently. I had been the one to step in, to keep things from getting out of hand. It wasn't a heroic moment, but it was a moment that mattered. It was a test, and I passed it not because I was perfect, but because I had learned how to act in the right way. By the time we docked for a brief respite at the next port, I had come full circle. The man who had arrived on the destroyer, hot-headed, quick to anger, and impulsive, wasn't the same man standing on the deck now. Sure, I still had a lot to learn, but the journey I had gone through during this deployment had transformed me in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't about the clothes I had thrown into the ocean. It wasn't about the mistakes I made at the start. It was about how I had handled those mistakes, how I had learned to make amends, and how I had become someone the crew could rely on, not just to do his job, but to be a part of something bigger. Mike and I had moved past the laundry incident, and while we never really became best friends, we had reached a kind of understanding. The respect we had for each other was unspoken but clear. The crew was more cohesive, and I felt like I was finally fitting in, not as the guy who messed up, but as a guy who had learned from his mistakes and had earned his place on the ship. Rick's words echoed in my mind. It's about responsibility. Taking responsibility for yourself, your actions, your crew. Those words became my guiding principles, and as I stood on the deck looking out at the horizon, I felt proud. Proud not just of the work I had done, but of the person I was becoming. This deployment, with all its trials and tests, had taught me more than I could have ever expected. And if I could give any advice to anyone in a similar situation, whether in the Navy or in life, it would be this: don't let your mistakes define you. Learn from them. Own them. And then, be better. It's the only way forward. Because when you learn how to fix the messes you make, you earn something far more valuable than respect. You earn the trust and integrity that will follow you long after the deployment is over.